it is highly likely that Israel and its allies know exactly where these nuclear research sites are, and predominantly around the second city of Isfahan. Now, to strike them with precision-guided weapons is unlikely to cause a nuclear explosion. So, in other words, unlikely to prevent a lot of contamination. In order to have a nuclear reaction, you need quite a complex chain reaction with highly enriched uranium to do that. We know that they haven't got highly enriched uranium, and an explosion itself would not create the chain reaction. There would be certainly some contamination in the local area. Well, I think the first thing to say about the confrontation between Israel and Iran, the area of imbalance at the moment is the nuclear area. Israel, although not publicly declared, I think everybody who knows anything about this area understands that Israel does have a nuclear capability. However, at the moment, Iran doesn't. But it has been trying to gain a nuclear capability for some time, and there has been much discussion between the Americans and the British and others and the International Atomic Energy Agency to make sure that Iran doesn't gain a nuclear capability. But at the moment, we think that the Iranians have been researching and developing two elements to having a nuclear weapon. Firstly, the actual warhead itself. In order to create a nuclear warhead, you generally need uranium and highly enriched uranium. Now, uranium is also used in nuclear power stations, which Iran has several. So, legitimately, it has uranium. But it's all about the concentration of uranium. To create a bomb, you need highly enriched. Uranium in a nuclear power station is enriched to about 20%. To have a viable nuclear device, you need to enrich it to about 95%. And you do this by using hundreds of centrifuges to create the highly enriched uranium. We know that Iran has hundreds of centrifuges and has been trying to enrich uranium. The last time intelligence leaked about this, it was thought that they were maybe at the 80% mark, so not too far off actually having the material to create the bomb. You then need the technical infrastructure and design for a nuclear device, and we know that they've been doing that for some time. And the research laboratories that do this are thought to be mainly centered around Isfahan, the second city in Iran. The second element, having a nuclear capability, and we're talking about a ballistic nuclear weapon rather than what we call a battlefield nuclear weapon. A battlefield nuclear weapon generally has a range of about 400 miles. So considering that Israel is 2,000 kilometers, 1,500 miles away from Iran, that wouldn't work. So a ballistic capability, in other words, a ballistic missile. We know that Iran has lots of ballistic missiles. 200 were fired at Israel last week. We know that Iran has recently given a lot of ballistic missiles to its ally, Russia. And we'll come back to Russia because they're important in all of this. But it is not an inconsequential task to fit the warhead to the missile and then to fire it. We've seen from the missile attacks from Iran to Israel in both April and last week that 95% of them fired at Israel have been knocked down in the sky, either by Israel itself or by Israeli allies. So we have two issues here. First of all, it is likely that Iran does have a nuclear ballistic missile that is capable of carrying a nuclear warhead. At the moment, we don't believe it has a nuclear warhead, but it is working very hard and is getting very much closer to do that. So when Israel looks at what it is going to do in retaliation for the most recent missile attacks, and of course in retaliation for Iran resourcing and supporting the terror groups Hezbollah and Hamas, striking its nuclear research capabilities would seem to be a sensible thing to do to prevent Iran getting a nuclear weapon, which would then potentially create a nuclear fight between Israel and Iran that could bring in a whole host of other people. Now, the actual mechanisms for doing this, we saw in April that Israel has the capability to attack sites in Iran. it is highly likely that Israel and its allies know exactly where these nuclear research sites are, and predominantly around the second city of Isfahan. Now, to strike them with precision guided weapons is unlikely to cause a nuclear explosion. So, in other words, unlikely to prevent a lot of contamination. In order to have a nuclear reaction, you need quite a complex chain reaction with highly enriched uranium to do that. We know that they haven't got highly enriched uranium, and an explosion itself would not create the chain reaction. There would be certainly some contamination in the local area. So I think it's perfectly feasible that the Israelis could attack the nuclear laboratories that are designing and developing Iran's nuclear capability without creating a massive contamination issue. Undoubtedly, there would be collateral damage in the local area, but to prevent a wider nuclear exchange, I would have thought this is the most viable thing that perhaps the Israelis could do in return for the missiles that were fired at Israel last week and in April as well.
How dangerous is it to strike a nuclear facility of this type? A lot of people, even thinking about civil nuclear uranium, will still have this idea that it is a very dangerous thing.
Certainly, I mean, yes, absolutely. Any missile strike on anywhere is dangerous, without a shadow of a doubt. As soon as you mention the nuclear word, then in perception terms and psychological terms, it makes it even more dangerous. However, the amount of uranium and potentially plutonium is also used as what we call an accelerant, an accelerator, that would be in these sites would be relatively small. If we look at, we've discussed what would happen in Ukraine if a Ukraine nuclear power station was attacked, and everybody, I'm sure most people are aware of what happened when the Ukrainian nuclear power station at Chernobyl blew up in the 80s, created a huge amount of contamination. There would be a lot more radiological isotopes, nuclear material at a nuclear power station than there would be at a research laboratory. I think that is the number one thing. It would be impossible to avoid contamination completely. But before nuclear warheads are assembled and put into production, it would strike me as that is the least worst option to do it, and would be unlikely to see widespread contamination. However, if the Israelis decided to attack some of the Iranian nuclear power stations, and there was a very large one on their eastern seaboard at Bashir, on the Gulf Coast, that would be a different issue, I think, particularly because having done some work for some of the Gulf states on the potential contamination, if Bashir had an accident, and it is on 3 geographical fault lines, so it's not in an ideal position. The contamination would likely spread across the Gulf to Saudi Arabia and Qatar and the United Arab Emirates, creating tremendous amounts of contamination. So that's a slightly different issue. But attacking a nuclear laboratory should produce a relatively small amount of nuclear contamination.
And as you've said there, Iran doesn't at the moment have a nuclear ICBM. They're unlikely to be able to retaliate with any sort of nuclear attack in the sense we'd understand it. How might they respond or retaliate to that, though? I mean, is there the possibility of something like a sort of what would be called a dirty bomb, or a more conventional response to a possible Israeli attack?
Well, certainly, and the Ayatollahs in Tehran have threatened that. I think their conventional ballistic missile capability has seen to be pretty inept, and the fact that 95% of them have been knocked out of the sky and not really having much impact on Israel, I think they're pretty constrained by that. Of course, in the past they've relied on Hezbollah and Hamas and the Houthis to do their dirty work, as it were. There could be another WMD, weapon of mass destruction. We certainly know in the Iran-Iraq war that Iran used a lot of chemical weapons, a lot of nerve agents like sarin. Whether they still have that capability, one would being the terror state that they are, one assumes that they might well have it. And actually, a ballistic missile full of a nerve agent would probably be a more dangerous prospect, because even if that's knocked out of the sky over Israel, the nerve agent would still land in Israel and have an impact. So that would be a concern, and that would be, in sort of legal terms, Geneva Convention, Chemical Weapons Convention terms, that would be viewed in the same way as a nuclear strike. I think the only slight unknown in all of this is what Russia's part is. We know that Iran gave Russia a lot of ballistic missiles recently. One assumes the quid pro quo for that was probably nuclear know-how. In a similar vein, the sort of third axis to this evil triumvirate is North Korea, who may well be a bit more advanced in their nuclear capability than the Iranians. We know that they have actually created a nuclear warhead and they have missiles. Whether Russia has also given them know-how, because the North Koreans have given the Russians a lot of ballistic missiles, and no doubt the three are sharing information and intelligence. But having said all that, I think at this stage, here in October 2024, I would gauge that Iran still has no nuclear capability. When we talk about dirty bombs or an improvised nuclear device, that is certainly possible. But the amount of contamination, even if you put radiological isotopes, nuclear material in a conventional missile, if you like, and fired it at Israel, yeah, you'd get some contamination, but not a huge amount. You would probably have a better effect by using a chemical weapon like sarin. Whether they could create some nuclear accident again is possible, but I think it's unlikely. I would have thought, if I just put my military hat on, there are too many unknowns here. So, Iran would have hoped that would have had the nuclear capability, and if nothing is done, it probably will do. And the conflict with Israel has probably focused the Ayatollahs on their conventional and nuclear deterrence more than anything else, and no doubt they'll be striving to do it, which is, when one looks at how Israel could retaliate, there was, first of all, suggestion from President Biden that they should strike their oil fields, which I think he has now turned his back on that, because that would create a hell of a lot of contamination around the place. And cynically, one could say it would put up the price of fuel. And with the American elections coming up very soon, apparently people in the US are more concerned about the price of petrol than they are about most things. So that would be a bit of an own goal for President Biden. So when you take all that in the round, it might sound a bit strange thing to say. Probably the least risky is to take out Iran's nuclear power research facilities, which would create less contamination today and hopefully head off nuclear confrontations in future.
And what are the chances of success if the Israelis do actually attack these Iranian facilities? Is there a risk, if they aren't able to completely destroy them, that it could cause Iran to double down on its nuclear program?
Well, I think Iran is going full speed on its nuclear program, whatever happens. So whatever stall or whatever damage can be done to it will impact on that. But having said that, the Israelis have demonstrated that they can fire ballistic missiles accurately and hit their targets in Iran. Iran doesn't have the air defense systems like Israel's Iron Dome. And Iran has rather, taken the ball off its conventional defenses, I think, in the last few years. Again, looking for the golden egg that a nuclear capability will give them. And they're sort of rather, stuck in between those two capabilities. So I think Israel has a fair chance with its precision-guided missiles and weapons of maybe not completely destroying Iran's nuclear research facilities, but damaging them enough to put the possibility of a nuclear capability of Iran back, months, if not years.